Welcome, everyone. We'll give it a minute here and then we'll get started.
All right, guys, we have about a full load here. Our capacity goes up to 100 people, and we hit that, which is amazing. So thank you all for attending. Right now, I see the room is filling up. We're at about 43 now. So we're just going to give it a minute for a few more people to filter in, and then we'll get started with our presentation. So just hold on about a minute and we'll get going in a second.
Get a drink. City water.
All right, Mike, it looks like we're at about half capacity right now, but the number has started or stopped going up. So I think we're at about the amount of people we're going to have right at the beginning here. People will start to filter in. But for the people who are here on time, why don't we get this going? Just a few notes to those in the audience. I believe that the way we have it set, you guys can send chat messages to us. I don't believe the rest of the crowd can see those for security reasons. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. If you have any questions throughout the presentation today, we ask that you use the Q&A function, not the chat function. At the end, after both Jay and John's presentations, we'll be answering a couple questions at the very end. So if you want to communicate a question to us, please use the Q&A function and not the chat function. Mike, I'm going to send this over to you to get this thing kicked off. Thanks, everyone, for attending.
Okay, welcome, everybody. If you have signed up, 1 second. If you're here for the Newport Surfrider chapter meeting with panelists talking about sand movement and how it affects use on the beach, you're in the right place. And if you're not, stick around. It's going to be real interesting. I'm Mike Harrington. I am the chairman of the Newport chapter of Surfrider Foundation. Our mission is the protection and enjoyment of the world's oceans, waves, and beaches. So we have two panelists tonight, Jay Sennewald, Jonathan Allan, and I'll have a few announcements to make, and then we will get to the panelists. I am the chairman of the Newport chapter, and the disembodied voice that you heard is Kevin Peters. He is behind the scenes, pulling the strings. He's kind of like the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain. And I want to mention a little bit of Surfrider business first. A lot of people got information about this meeting from our newsletter, but I'm sure there are some people in the audience who don't get our newsletter. And if you're interested in it, it is a mostly monthly, comes via email. And if you go to newportsurfrider.org and hit the contact button, my email address is there, and email me directly and I'll put you on the list and you can get our newsletter. If you are a member of the local chapter, a dues paying member, thank you very much. And if you aren't and you're interested in our mission and interested in supporting our protection efforts around here, you can join online Kevin will put up a link in the chat, and you can go to that link and join Surfrider. The dues are on a sliding scale. They're from $25 to $2,500, and it's up to you to decide where you fit on that scale. So we encourage you to join the chapter and support our efforts. And then over the past year, the chapter, as due to COVID, our chapter activities have been pretty limited. We've had a few supply drop-offs for beach cleanups. All of our meetings are online. We are looking forward to and planning an ambitious 2021. And the success of those efforts for the chapter depends on volunteers. There's lots of opportunities to volunteer with the chapter, but we do have some specific needs. At the current time, we don't have a beach cleanup coordinator, and we'd really like to get going on our beach cleanups again. So we're looking for somebody to just oversee that effort. Also, we're looking for somebody to coordinate our media efforts, because getting the word out about what we're doing is critical. And right now, a lot of things are falling through the cracks. So anybody with energy or experience in a media field, we need some help in that area. And then it would be great to have someone coordinate our efforts to fight plastic pollution. And that includes Surfrider programs like Ocean Friendly Restaurants and state and local campaigns to address styrofoam, takeout containers, and plastic foodware. None of these, so if you're interested in reducing plastic pollution and you think you can help in any capacity, that would be great. None of these rules are rigid. They can be modified to meet people's interests. There will be a link in the chat that will put you through to our volunteer coordinator, who is Stephanie Field. And we welcome anybody and everybody to get involved with the chapter. If any of these things rock your boat, go to the website, go to the volunteer page, and see what's there. That's our business. The business is over. I encourage you to get more involved with the local chapter or in any conservation efforts that involve taking care of the ocean. So I want to introduce our first panelist. The Q&A will be at the end of the program. And our first panelist is Jay Sennewald, who is the Ocean Shore Coordinator for Oregon Parks and Rec. And I will let Jay explain to you what he does. Take it away, Jay.
Thanks for the introduction there, Mike. So Jay Sennewald, Ocean Shores Coordinator for Oregon Parks and Recreation Department, AKA State Parks. State Parks has management responsibility for 362 miles of Oregon shoreline, whether it's rocky shoreline or beach and dune or bluff-back shoreline, and it's a big responsibility. I'm the only staff person for State Parks that's overseeing the administration of state park rules, so it's a heavy lift, and there's a lot of the responsibility I take very seriously. Initially, I had planned on giving a PowerPoint presentation to you all. I have several PowerPoint presentations depending on my audience, and I was going to have to customize one for tonight. Unfortunately, the recent high surf events of Sunday and Tuesday were significant, and they caused a lot of problems, property damage, and so I had to shift gears. And I've been working on emergencies to try to protect properties that are in imminent peril of damage or destruction from erosion resulting from the storm. And that erosion, even though the surf's down today, is still ongoing. So it's been a challenge. So what I decided to do tonight is just give a quick verbal overview of the state parks permitting requirements and ocean shore regulations, and then how we process those types of requests when people want to alter the shoreline, and maybe a couple of other tidbits, and then I'll take questions at the end of the meeting or before we close the meeting. So as I mentioned, 362 miles of shoreline. Most of my work's involved with shoreline alterations, otherwise known as ocean shore alteration permits. And there's different types of shoreline alterations. Some of them you're familiar with. Riprap or shoreline armoring tends to be the one that generates the most interest, public interest, and oftentimes controversy surrounding the placement of riprap and other shoreline hardening type of efforts. And I'm in the process right now of working through a couple of permits that are active, and of course that involves public participation. I'll get that into that here in just a minute. So different types of shoreline alterations include riprap, sand alteration, and an example of a sand alteration would be fore-dune grading. We see fore-dune grading at several communities on the coast, including Seaside, Cannon Beach, Manzanita, Pacific City, and Bayshore in the Walport area. Most all these types areas are on the central north coast, and they're challenging. What triggers the need for a sand alteration permit is the fill or removal of 50 cubic yards or more of material. State parks can waive certain sand alteration projects if under certain circumstances may waive, for example, clearing of emergency and public access ways, areas where sand is inundating buildings or infrastructure. It can be returned to the ocean shore with heavy equipment like excavators or bobcats or skid steers, those type of things. Sand alteration is one. Public access ways that require structural encroachments on the shoreline. We've seen a lot of permits go out for mostly municipalities. Cannon Beach, for example, has been active in improving their beach access stairways with hardened steel and concrete type structures that withstand the forces of waves and logs ramming into them and those type of things. And so that's another type. We also theoretically issue permits for natural product removal. That could be sand, it could be gravel, it could be wood products like logs, and also salvage type things. So the process for permits is essentially the same. It involves preparing an application with all sorts of details, question about property ownership, potential impacts to the beach, impacts to recreation, impacts to adjoining properties, impacts to ocean views, shoreline scenery, shoreline vegetation. We consider public safety. We consider cultural resources and cultural artifacts. People don't realize it, but the Native Americans, indigenous people were here living on the shoreline long before settlers showed up. And so anytime there's earth disturbing activities, we partner up with the State Historic Preservation Office to make sure that adequate protections are in place to make sure that none of the cultural resources are disturbed, or if they have to be disturbed, that there's coordination with qualified archaeologists and the tribes. So we have a lot of partnerships with other agencies, state, local, federal governments in our permitting processes. And it's quite complicated, actually. It's a challenging position to be in, to have to be able to sew everything together and make sure that all the stakeholders in any given project are provided an opportunity to be involved in those type of decisions. So maybe I should back up and describe the ocean shore that state parks manages, because I failed to do that in the beginning. But the ocean shore is defined in statute and rule as the land between extreme low tide and the statutory vegetation line or the actual line of vegetation, whichever is further landward. And the statutory line is a surveyed line that was established as a direct result at the adoption of the Oregon's Beach Bill from 1967, pioneered by Governor Tom McCall. And so there's a surveyed line on the beach, and we have maps and other resources that can help us identify the approximate location of that line. It can be identified in the field by a surveyor if there's some question about where it is. So that's one potential boundary, and the other boundary where there's cases where there's erosion has actually moved the shoreline and moved the actual beach location. The actual line of upland shore vegetation is the boundary when erosion has taken place. And in many cases, like Glen Eden Beach is a good example, where the statutory line might be 20 or even 30 feet out onto the open sand beach, and the actual line of vegetation where the erosion has taken everything else on the beach side of it would be our jurisdictional boundary. So now that I've sort of clarified our jurisdictional boundary, I'll move on. Another thing I want to explain, there's sort of a misconception that Oregon State Parks owns the beach and owns the sand and owns the shoreline, and that's not necessarily the case. In many locations up and down the coast, the shoreline is actually privately owned. Many properties, older properties in particular, have deeds that describe the property boundary on the west end as the mean high tide line of the Pacific Ocean. So what the beach bill did was it established a public recreation easement over private property that allows the rights of the public to free and uninterrupted access to the ocean shore, consistent with past use of the beach for recreation purposes. And no, it's not a state highway. It was a state highway decades ago when Oswald West was the governor of state parks, and the shifting responsibilities for the state parks have gone to ODOT in the past. Occasionally, for a while, it was Department of State Lands and State Parks, and now it's just State Parks that has this jurisdiction. So in exchange for the public recreation rights on private property on the ocean shore, property owners are exempt from property taxes on that portion of their property subject to ocean shore regulations. So there is a trade-off. And many property owners don't realize that they have not lost all of their property rights on the portion of the property that they own that happens to be on the ocean shore. For example, the owners actually own the sand on the beach. And if somebody proposed to alter the sand through a permit process to move sand or to alter the sand or to grade the dunes, it requires the underlying property owner's permission. So a little bit complicated in terms of layers of ownership, and every case is a little bit different and unique up and down the coast. And there might be some questions that come out of that, and I'll be happy to answer questions about ownership and jurisdiction at the end of my short presentation here. So there's other types of considerations for ocean shore regulations. The rules for the ocean shore are found in Oregon Administrative Rules, Chapter OAR 736. Chapter 20 is the ocean shore alterations and construction standards, and Chapter 21 is the recreation rules that establishes what people can do and defines what type of recreational activities are allowed and which are not. For example, people can take souvenirs, small amounts of natural materials, like 1 bucket of 5-gallon bucket of sand per day, for example, and no more than 5 containers per year. Driftwood, people can take what they can pick up and carry off as long as it doesn't account for more than 3 cubic yards per year per person. No mechanical equipment can be used to remove logs. Firewood can only be collected with a permit if a chainsaw is being used, and we're sort of cutting back in the last few years on the issuance of firewood permits. And part of the reason for that is because the natural log accumulations on the shoreline in Oregon have been depleted over several years, and people have over harvested it, really, and that's a management problem, and it's come to our attention. So we're trying to reverse the trend and allow Mother Nature through the types of natural occurrences that just happened in the last week to redistribute logs down the rivers and that have been embedded in sand dunes. And so you're all going to notice there's a lot more logs and driftwood on the beach in the weeks to come than there have been historically. And so hopefully the pirates won't go out there and take too many of the logs for their own personal use. And if somebody's out using a chainsaw on the beach, more likely than not, they probably don't have a permit. So you might want to, if you're concerned about that and you see that going on, you might want to call your local state park office and send a beach ranger. They'll send a beach ranger out there and make contact with the people and educate them about the limitations of chainsaw use and driftwood removal. So all sorts of things from algae harvest, seaweed, people, believe it or not, collect seaweed, and there's limitations on that. We have to partner with other agencies, for example, ODF&W, and marine gardens and marine sanctuaries. A lot going on the rocky shorelines too. So let me see, what am I missing here? Beach driving. At this point in time, the administrative rules have designated certain beaches as open to motor vehicles. An example of that would be Clatsop Plains between Gearhart and Fort Stevens State Park. Is one good example. There's hundreds of cars driving on the beach every day. Other beaches, most of the beaches on the North Coast are actually closed to motor vehicles. That's for the protection of resources, people's enjoyment of the ocean shore. I keep making the point as an example of why beach driving is not allowed, is if you could imagine all the people that like to walk down the shoreline in peace and quiet and enjoy the natural surroundings, or they might be getting up at 5 in the morning in the winter to walk the beach and look for glass floats. Could you imagine someone coming by in a motor vehicle, which includes e-bikes actually, and coming past someone looking for a float? They just see a float 300 yards in the distance and some guy in a e-bike swings along in front of him and scoops it up before they can reach it. Could you imagine how that person would feel after years of hunting for a float? So e-bikes are regulated. They're considered motor vehicles. Check the regulations in the beach you want to go on before you bring your e-bikes out. And that's been a hard message to deliver to the public too, and it's hard to enforce. Enforcement of ocean shore rules is typically a soft pedal approach. We began our enforcement at a lower level of educating people, advising them, asking them to follow the rules, and then enforcement steps up as those discussions, depending on what the reaction is of the public or the person we're making contact with. Enforcement's a very difficult thing, especially at my level. We have the beach rangers out there all the time, and they're basically enforcing safety regulations and minor violations like people carving names in the banks or leaving garbage or digging holes in the sand, which presents a hazard for the beach rangers who are driving on the beach, trying to keep everybody safe and watching over things. So enforcement's a part of what we do. Unfortunately, it's a little bit difficult to keep up. There's a lot of things going on 362 miles of shoreline with just a handful of people to try to keep tabs on it. If you're concerned about something that you see happening and you're wondering if it's within the framework of the rules, you can contact me directly, contact your local state park office on the coast. I think we have 12 state park offices between Fort Stevens and Harris Beach at Brookings. So most of the state park offices are within 45-minute or an hour drive of any given location on the coast, and they're fully staffed all the time. So if you have a question or concern, if you can't reach me, you can reach out to the local state park office, and staff there should be able to direct you to the appropriate staff member to address your concerns. So I could potentially go on and on all night. What I'd like to do is get together with Mike and other chapters of Surfrider as well, and maybe come back a little bit prepared at a future meeting with my PowerPoint presentation, which I think people would really enjoy. And I apologize for my lack of having that ready for you tonight. Hopefully you'll understand under the circumstances. And I look forward to watching Jonathan's presentation next. And thanks for letting me go first, because he's a hard act to follow. And save your questions till the end, and I'll stick around and I'll be happy to do my best to answer any questions that you have. So I'll sign off.
Thanks, Jay. That was great. That is
You're
a lot of
welcome.
information.
Yeah.
Um, the other half of our panel is Jonathan Allan, who is a geomorphologist, look it up, with the Oregon Department of Geology and Mineral Industries. Jonathan's been on the coast working on beach hazard issues and changes for a couple of decades now. And in 2004, John established the Oregon Beach Shoreline Monitoring Program to begin documenting seasonal and interannual changes in Oregon beaches. So he's well versed in what's going on out there on the beach, and I will turn it over to him. Go ahead, John.
Thanks, Mike. And just checking, people can see my screen? Excellent. All right. Well, first up, thank you, Mike, very much for the opportunity to speak tonight. Mike gave me a ring a few weeks ago with some questions about sand movement in the Agate Beach area specifically, and we had a bit of a conversation about that, which led to the request here to come along and speak to you all about some of the things that we're seeing with respect to sand changes taking place along the Oregon coast. So what I'm obviously going to focus on this evening is really centered on our backyard here, which is obviously the Newport area. But that Newport area is actually made up of pretty extensive section of coast that extends all the way down to essentially Cape Perpetua in the far south there that you can see in the distance sticking out into the ocean. I want to acknowledge a few folks, two colleagues of mine, Laura Gable and Fletcher O'Brien, who are instrumental in helping myself collect a lot of the data that we are able to observe along the coast, not just here in Newport, but actually we are observing changes taking place at multiple sites up and down the Oregon coast, with the primary goal of better understanding, as Mike indicated, this sort of seasonal variability, interannual variability, and as you accumulate data over long term, you can start to begin to understand, decadal to multi-decadal changes, which is really essential for effective management of our, very valuable beach resource. And then the last thing I want to acknowledge is the work that we do here is largely funded through what's called the Northwest Association of Networked Ocean Observing Systems. Some of you may have been to the website, nanus.org, where you can find information about the types of beach changes that I'm going to be talking about a little bit more in due course, but also, observations about waves and currents, wind conditions, oceanographic conditions, the health of the ocean, effectively is all provided through this, effectively this one-stop site where a lot of oceanographic and meteorological and even geologic information can be now accessed. And so I encourage you to take a moment to go and check out that site. There's even a web app devoted to surfers with information about surfing conditions and forecasts and things like that. So the map here, I'd like to just start off with just showing a map of the area. Obviously, just highlighting the Newport cell, which basically, as I mentioned at the very beginning, extends from Cape Perpetua in the far south, just down past Yarharts there, and extends all the way up to Yaquina Head, being the sort of northern extent of this entire, what we call littoral cell. And a littoral cell is basically a headland-bounded stretch of coastline in which sand is able to move about along the shoreline in both, in this case here, north and southerly movements, as well as what we call in the on-offshore direction. So the cross-shore direction, moving from the beach out into the ocean during the winter months, and then reversing as that sand is driven back onto the beaches to build the beaches again over a seasonal cycle. We also have another littoral cell just a little bit further north, which is the Beverly Beach cell. And in reality, one could actually make a strong case for these two cells being effectively one, because I'm pretty confident that sand actually leaks around Yaquina Head. It's probably fairly small volumes of sand that gets around there, which is that may be feeding into the Beverly Beach cell, but it's such negligible quantities that may be feeding around there, because we consider Beverly Beach a sand-starved cell. It has a very limited volume of sand in there. It has very limited sources of sand. And as a result, it's very dynamic in how it responds rapidly to big storm events. So when Mike contacted me, he was wanting me to talk a little bit about what was specifically happening in the Newport area along Agate Beach. But as you can imagine from just looking at this map here, the changes that you see in the Newport area are really a function of changes that are taking place along this entire section of coast. And so the responses that we see is actually much more complicated than what would be envisaged just by focusing on one small little section. So in terms of understanding coastal change and beach accretion and beach erosion and shoreline dynamics and things like that, one really has to start with first principles in terms of, where our sand comes from. What I can tell you is that, our sandy beaches, our barrier spits, largely began to form in their sort of present configuration at around 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. So they're fairly recent phenomena. And that time frame really coincides with the period in time when sea level basically was approaching about the level it is today. We know that at around 18,000 years ago, at the peak of the last glaciation, the ocean shoreline along Oregon was around 30 to 60 miles off our coastline at around the 400-foot bathy contour, which puts it right out on the edge of the continental shelf there. So that's where sea level was at the peak of the last glaciation. So over the last 18,000 years, sea level rose rapidly. And then in the last 5,000 to 6,000 years, sand started to actually be pushed onto our, into these embayments along our coastline, started to become trapped between these headlands, as you can see in the far distance there. That's actually Cape Lookout. So this is actually looking south along the Netart's littoral cell. So where does all that sand come from? Well, it comes from multiple sources. These sources include sand coming off the land from erosion of bluffs, from streams and rivers that carries it into the estuaries. It also may be a product of erosion of dunes, like out on the barrier spits. And we also see sand moving in multiple directions. Over a seasonal cycle between summer and winter, sand moves onto the beaches in the summertime and then offshore in the winter times. And we see that happening in our backyard over the last couple of months in terms of the changes that have taken place down on Agate Beach. But sand may also be moving laterally along the shore in what we call the alongshore direction as a result of currents that are set up by waves as they travel and refract along our coastline and break in the on the bars. And that process actually sets up currents within the breaker zone that actually drive sediment movement in a variety of different ways. And those directions are largely dictated by the orientation in which the waves are arriving. And I'm sure many of you who surf in multiple spots along the coast here are probably very familiar with these types of processes. We know that in terms of potential losses of sediment, we can lose sand in a variety of different ways. We can lose sand into the estuaries where they begin to accumulate as bars. And then in the most extreme storms, we can actually lose sand offshore into deeper water. And any sand that's moved out into this deeper water, it becomes very difficult for that sand to actually get back onto the beaches. And so those are potential areas where we may lose sand. We may also lose sand, obviously, from processes, human type effects, such as by mining sand on beaches. Or we can actually lose sand by hardening coastlines, particularly if the amount of hardening along a coastline expands to such a degree that it actually eliminates sediment that would otherwise be available from, let's say, the erosion of beaches and dunes. So this system is very dynamic. A lot of sediment moves around and responds very rapidly to storm events. So we have to understand how these changes are taking place, and they actually occur at many different time and spatial scales. And this little sort of cartoon is an attempt to try to capture these types of changes. So we can define changes in the on-offshore direction that are largely controlled by individual storms. And that typically extends out through the first couple of sandbars that you see offshore our beaches. As we get into larger scale temporal changes, time changes, then we get into seasonal effects. And those effects start to extend further offshore into even deeper water. And then there are changes that are a product of larger scale climate events. The most notable that impacts our coastline is the El Nino Southern Oscillation, which happens roughly every 3 years for small scale events and more like 10 to 15 years for major El Nino events. And El Ninos have really a very significant effect in terms of sediment transport, waves, and processes like that, not just on the Oregon coast, but actually we've found relationships taking place along the entire Pacific Basin as a result of these El Nino events. At even longer time scales, we have effects associated with what we call the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. There are strong relationships between El Ninos and PDOs, and I'll touch on that a little bit more in due course. And then obviously, one of the concerns is when we start talking about decadal and multi-decadal changes, then we're talking about impacts associated with climate change, sea level rise, and obviously tectonic changes. So all of these processes are operating at a variety of different scales and obviously impacts along our coastline. So in terms of beaches, we can effectively differentiate these sort of patterns of change in this cartoon on the left-hand side there. And what you see are two examples of end members of change. In blue and pointing sort of in the positive direction, we see a trend line showing accretion. And probably the best example that I can point to, other than Agate Beach down here in Newport, but obviously up on the Clatsop Plains, Clatsop Spit in particular has undergone very significant accretion over the last 120 years as a result of changes imposed at the mouth of the Columbia River with the building of the jetties there. At the other end of the scale, we can identify erosional type responses that may be occurring over a long term. And a best example of this right now, where we're seeing pretty significant erosion taking place, is up in Tillamook County and specifically in the Rockaway Beach area, as well as Nesquin Beach area, where we've seen pretty significant erosion over the last 40 years. So these long-term patterns are then, on those long-term trends, a lot of variability that takes place. So that's the noise that's being driven by variations in wave conditions between seasons, variations in currents and things like that that drive sediment about. And then within that, those sort of seasonal perturbations, we have these long-term trends. And we can see two examples on the right-hand side there of data that we've plotted. We've collected. These are from seasonal observations along the Clatsop Plains in the north there. We can see the Clatsop Plains. This is from about midway along Clatsop Plains there, where it's accreting at about just under half a meter, so about 1 to 2 feet per year since at least the late 1990s when we started observing these areas. In contrast, we can see down by Rockaway, this side here is eroding at about 0.4 meters, so about 1.5 feet per year, but with a lot of variability intertwined among these events. One of the other observations you can see from these patterns of trends is the impacts of extreme storms. So for example, in the case of Rockaway, we see this very significant erosion that happened in 1997-98, and that was a product of the El Nino, where the beaches actually down in this Rockaway area cut back 60 feet in one particular winter, and led to very extensive need for shoreline hardening to protect infrastructure, homes, etc., in those areas. So there are lots of processes that as I touched on, that drive these changes. These include, obviously, and not surprisingly, the biggest ones being storm generated waves. Bigger waves cause bigger changes. From work that myself and others at Oregon State have been doing over the last 3 decades, we've actually identified there was a phase there where we were seeing a progressive increase in storm wave heights between the 1970s up through to around early 2000. Since then, that process has actually reversed, and we've actually been seeing up until the last few years a general decline in mean sort of wave heights offshore the Pacific Northwest of Oregon and Washington. And these wave events can be actually enhanced under certain conditions. And I highlight in red there conditions associated with El Ninos. Basically, El Ninos cause a larger increase in mean wave heights along our coastline. And then obviously, over the longer term, climate change may start to impact as well. Other factors that drive some of the erosion and sediment patterns that we see are a product of sea level changes. On our coastline, ocean water levels vary by about 1 to 2 feet between summer conditions when ocean water levels are depressed because of cold water upwelling along our coastline, compared with winter months when that ocean upwelling breaks down. Our water temperatures warm up, and as a result of that, just through thermal expansion, our water levels actually increase in height by about 1 to 2 feet. Sorry, about 1 feet. Under El Nino conditions, those changes actually increase even more substantially. We can see just under El Nino storm conditions, water levels that would increase by up to 2 feet over that winter season. So that's an enhancement. And obviously when you increase water levels and you put storm waves on top of them, as you see in this particular image here, those waves are able to reach further up on the back of the beach there and start to chew into the bluffs. And this is an example of a pretty neat storm that happened down by Nye Beach there, looking north towards Yaquina Head. You can sort of see Jump Off Joe in mid distance there, and you can see the impacts of essentially what we call a saturated beach, where there is effectively no beach under this circumstances as waves are swashing in and running up on the beach there. The other factor that's very important are what we call changes in sand movement, and this is largely driven by wave approach, and I mentioned that before. So here's a kind of a cartoon of kind of the normal conditions based on our environment off here. So typically during summer months, as you all know, our prevailing wave climate is actually from the west to northwest. We also have strong north to northwesterly winds that set up. And what that does is it tends to the waves drive the sand onto the beaches. And so our beaches actually accrete. Those winds actually drive the sand that starts to be exposed in the intertidal zone where they dry out, and they're carried inland to form the sort of ephemeral dunes that you see down along Agate Beach there in the summertime that starts to build up. In the winter, that process is reversed. We experience bigger waves. Most of these come from the west to southwest, and then that increase in wave energy basically erodes the beaches down. That sand is then taken offshore where they start to accumulate as sandbars, and the process then repeats itself over time. I've touched on El Nino conditions a number of times, and this is a very significant phenomenon that really truly impacts our coastline quite dramatically. You know, essentially under the normal summer wave conditions, the pattern is identical to what you see in a normal year. Waves come out of the northwest, drive sand to the south. Under El Nino conditions, we experience much, much bigger waves. And those waves are actually shifted further south. so that our largest waves are actually coming out of the effectively the south-southwest quadrant. And you can see this in the diagram on the right there, which is basically a rose plot showing wave height by direction. And you can see that the largest waves are actually, which exceed sort of 10 meters. These are 30-foot high waves up to even 45-foot waves, predominantly arriving out of the south-southwest quadrant, compared to in the summer months, waves that are typically on the order of no more than a couple of meters, so about 6 feet, maybe 9 feet at the most. But typically 3 to 6 feet is a pretty good measure of summer wave conditions. So because of these larger waves coming out of the southwest there, we tend to see more enhanced erosion taking place at the south ends of these littoral cells, and enhanced movement of sand to the north where it starts to build up against the headlands. We also see impacts taking place at the round bay mouths, where we see enhanced erosion taking place. So there are other factors that drive erosion and sediment movement, and I'm not going to touch on those here just for the sake of time. So how do we go about tracking and monitoring these changes? Well, we can do this through a variety of ways, and Mike mentioned that in 2004 we started what's called the Oregon Beach Shoreline Observation System to basically document and monitor changes taking place on our beaches. And we're doing this at multiple sites, and you can access these data by going to nanus.org. There's a web app there for the beaches and shorelines. You can see all the stations both in Oregon and Washington. You can click on any of these points there, and you can get information about what's happening at those points. And that information may include things like cross sections, as you see kind of in the upper right corner there. We measure shorelines, basically tidal datum-based shorelines. And from all this information, we can start to develop trends over time. We do this by using what we call real-time kinematic GPS. So it's basically a fancy GPS that allows us to measure to about 1 centimeter accuracy. And we can put that on a backpack and walk out into the surf. We can also put it on a vehicle, a little ATV here that some of you probably seen from time to time as we drive up and down beaches here in Newport and elsewhere. And we can measure shoreline positions from all those data. So what I'm going to switch to now is kind of synthesizing some of the data, and what does it mean in terms of things that may be happening in our neck of woods, specifically in the Newport area initially. So the image on the right is a series of aerial photos that were actually taken in 1939. It's the first real coastwide suite of aerial photos available to us of the Oregon coast. And what's cool about these images is that they were taken in around January of 1939, immediately following a series of very extreme storms that caused pretty extensive erosion up and down the Oregon coast. So maybe not so easy to see, but there's a red dashed line running pretty close to the edge of the bluffs there that actually shows the shoreline in the 1920s. And this was defined by researchers from the National Ocean Service of NOAA, who physically actually were mapping shorelines on both the east and west coasts around, essentially starting in the early 1800s and through up until about the 1950s, but before they switched to more sort of modern technologies. And they literally would actually travel along the coastline, mapping what we call rack lines associated with the high tide line. What you can see from the 39 photo, though, is obviously there's very little beach present along this shoreline at that stage. Now, I recognize that it is an eroded beach, but I think it's quite telling, as you'll see the next series of slides, as to how these changes have taken place over time. So the next one is some photos that were taken in 1967. There's a blue dashed line that's just maybe barely recognizable there in front of the red line, showing accretion that's taken place between the 20s up through to obviously 1967. So the beaches actually started to widen out at this stage. By the time you get to 2018, which is the aerial photo here, And included on there is a black solid line, which is actually a measurement we made of the shoreline back in August of last year. And obviously it's pretty startling, the difference between these three images, showing how much sand is actually accumulated in this Newport area. There's a scale bar at the bottom there, and if you were to kind of use that scale bar and run along the coastline, you'll see that there are places where the beach is actually widened by anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 feet. Obviously, some of the widest areas are in the northern sort of third of up towards Agate Beach there, and then down by the jetties. And that's the other important sort of consideration here, is that around the early 1900s, jetties were constructed at the mouth of Yaquina Bay there. And what we've seen is very significant sand accumulation on both sides of those jetties there, as the coastal processes basically readjusted to the change in hydrodynamics at the mouth of the bay there, as it kind of transitioned to more of an equilibrium condition. We can zoom in a little bit more and sort of look a little bit more closely at these same areas. And so again, 1939 photo, looking at more closely at the Agate Beach area. You can actually see outcrops of rock sticking out in the photos. So beach elevations were very low at that stage at this north end here. And clearly, you know, at the time, Big Creek, where the Agate Beach wayside has now been established here. Big Creek at that stage was obviously going straight out, effectively in a east-west direction at that stage. You can also see, you know, water daylighting from various other places along that shoreline. So here's a close-up in 1967. You can see how the beaches started to widen out a little bit more. Even at that stage in 67, Big Creek there was still essentially running due east, east-west, without any sort of evidence, at least at this stage, of migrating along to the north there like it's doing today. And then obviously a close-up of the same area under today's condition, where Big Creek is now prevented from going directly offshore and is now running parallel with the coastline before daylighting up by Yaquina Head in the far north. So here's a series of photos that I was able to find. These are courtesy of state parks from various permits that have been requested by people over the years. These photos were actually taken in the 1970s. So you're looking basically east or northeast towards the Agate Beach golf course. You can see exposures out on the beach there of rock. This is Astoria Formation, mudstones. And then obviously you can see lots of woody debris at the back of the beach. You can actually even see extensive cobble accumulations at the base of those cliffs there. And what's also interesting is obviously the bluffs themselves are not very vegetated. They're actually, at that stage, they were subject to a lot more erosion than they are today. If you look at obviously the same area today, there's very extensive vegetation that's established now along these bluffs there, largely because of the accumulation of sand that's now preventing waves actually eroding into the back of the beach there. Here's a series of additional photos. The one in the upper left there is looking south towards Big Creek, taken in 1973, I'm thinking there. And you can see, obviously not a lot of sand there at the time. This is obviously a winter condition, but you can see very extensive gravel deposits extending well away from the bluffs there, extending all the way south towards Big Creek there. And then if you flip around looking north, you can see those rocky reef outcrops. And then the image on the right shows the extensive accumulation of gravels looking north towards Yaquina Head. And those gravels obviously extend all the way around up against the headland there, and probably was, you know, at the time was a good place to go and search for agates, you know, given the name of Agate Beach, I presume. So I guess the story that I'm trying to, you know, provide here is that for a long period of time, it appears that there wasn't a lot of sand on this particular stretch of beach. that what we've seen today is something that's probably much more recent. Certainly, probably post 1970s, there's certainly strong evidence that a lot of the accumulation that we're seeing is very recent. And so this is an attempt to kind of get at this by putting sort of some numbers on here. So all those little red lines correspond to areas where we actually do surveys. So one way we can actually extrapolate volumes for each of these stations is to basically take a cross section, figure out the volume of sand in that cross section, and then we can sum it along the coastline there for all these different sites there. And so the change images on the left there shows essentially seasonal changes that are a function of extreme El Nino conditions versus kind of a typical winter. So the extreme El Nino conditions are in red, and a typical winter is in yellow there. And what you find is that under El Nino seasonal changes, we see net losses on our beaches, or in this particular beach here, of around almost 1 million cubic yards of sand between a summer and winter condition. And this can be directly related to the increase in wave energy associated with El Nino conditions. So what happens in a more normal winter season? Well, our best measure of that is 2012, 2013, when we can identify a loss of about 560,000 cubic yards of sand then. And so, as mentioned there, wave energy around in the 2012, 2013 is kind of closer to what we would classify as normal. So we can then sum this in all these volumes. We can sum that for the period from 1997, which is actually our first real sequence of measurements derived from airborne LiDAR up through to the present. And what we find is that this particular stretch of shore has accumulated about 2.4 million cubic yards of sand over effectively a 23-year period. And so these bar graphs actually show the volume of sand changes. So in blue here is the net change from 1997 to 2020 for each of these stations. And what you can see is that obviously the largest accumulations are tending to happen in the far north, particularly in the Agate Beach, in the Big Creek area. So that's a lot of sand. And so the question becomes, well, where's all that sand coming from? Well, it's not straightforward, it's complicated. So before I get into that, we can actually start to look at changes that are happening specifically in the Big Creek area in terms of trends over time. And so these plots here for two different stations, and what they basically tell you is that at these two different sites, this area has been accumulating about 20 to 30 meters cube, which is around 30 to 40 cubic yards per linear meter of beach over the last 23 years. And that's a pretty steady accumulation, which is quite interesting. So where's the sand coming from? Well, as I kind of alluded to at the very beginning, we really have to sort of look at the bigger picture, which means looking at the entire cell, running from Yarharts in the very far south, all the way up to Yaquina Head in the far north. So this is kind of a nasty looking plot, and I apologize, but basically along the bottom x-axis, we've got a distance from the south end on the left to the north end, i.e. Yaquina Head on the right. And that's measured in terms of northings. On the y-axis, measurements of changes that have taken place at a specific contour interval, which is mean high water, or close to it. It's actually just above it. And our reference timeline is 1997, because that's when we had the first complete coastwide measurements using airborne LiDAR to map the elevations of our beaches and bluffs and things like that. And so 1997, which is that blue solid line or zero line, is our reference point. And so what I can do here is from all these stations where we're monitoring is we can actually look at changes that have taken place at all these different stations over different times. So the red sort of shaded area defines kind of what I would call the envelope of variability. This is the variation that's based on all our different surveys that reflects about 1 or 2 standard deviations about some average. And then in red is conditions associated with the extreme El Nino, and in black are conditions as measured in August of 2020. And then in blue there, vertical blue lines are actually the mouths of LC Bay and down by Newport, and in darker blue up to the right is obviously Yaquina Bay. What I want to point out is, and then I've identified locations of Big Creek and Beaver Creek as well, just as reference points. And there are names at the top of the plot there to show the different sections of shoreline as we go from south to north. The main takeaway messages from this type of plot is that what we're seeing is persistent erosion taking place in the area between Yachats and Newport. This area has been eroding at about anywhere from 10 to 20 meters from essentially 1997 up to the present. Obviously, there's a lot of variability that's interspersed between all these different sites. As you go north, you see very large changes taking place, particularly at the mouth of LC Spit, which then decreases as you go north. So no brainer, areas around Spit mouths or the mouths of Spits and the ends of Spits is extremely dynamic. And you can see how you can go from extreme accretion, where the beach may actually advance seaward by up to 400 feet, to extreme erosion, where it may cut back as much as 200 feet. So the total change there is some 600 feet in terms of linear distance. So very large changes. And then as we go north, we come up towards Yaquina here, up to South Beach, and we see sand piling up on the south side of South Beach. And then we see this very large pulse of sand that's accumulated essentially north of Yaquina Bay, where sand has been accumulating. We can sort of put best fit lines on there, and we can approximate the changes that are taking place at this site here. So my sort of model that I'm suggesting here is that the changes that we're seeing in the Newport area is really being driven by changes that are taking place at other locations all the way down along the entire Newport cell. We can actually quantify this, and this is a horrible looking series of plots, but we can actually figure out how much sand is moving about by doing some math. And what we find is that by looking at the alongshore distribution of currents, we can estimate movements of sand, and we can actually create cumulative totals of that over time based on looking at wave dynamics and estimating the role of waves in driving sand. And so the take-home message here is that if you look at the plot B, the big positive gains coincide with major El Nino years, and the blue coincide with La Nina years, which tend to be like this year. On average, wave conditions actually tend to fall away during La Nina conditions relative to El Ninos. So the take-home message of that B plot is that you see much more enhanced erosion and larger movement of sand to the north, which is the positive upward-looking jumps in the sand currents compared with downward movements. And so over time, over this period from 1980 to around 2016, effectively what this is telling us is that the net northward movement of sand, the net movement of sand is directed to the north over that long period of time. So the data, the hydrodynamics, is actually coinciding with the data we're seeing in terms of measurements along our beaches. We can see the same sort of pattern happening in other areas. So this is actually similar sort of data generated up in the Rockaway Beach area. So on the left is the Bay Ocean Spit, in the middle is Rockaway Beach, in the north is the Halem Spit, bounded by 2 jetties that break up these subcells. And what you're seeing in this particular area is effectively a reorientation of our shoreline. We're seeing erosion at the south ends of each of those subcells, and accumulation at the north ends. So for example, at Bay Ocean Spit, we're seeing very significant accumulation occurring on the south side of Tillamook Bay, and we're seeing massive erosion occurring on the north side of Tillamook Bay. And then as you go up towards the Nehalem Bay mouth there, we're seeing accumulations on the south side. And then that accumulation actually extends all the way north, all the way up to Manzanita near Carney Head. And the reason why you don't see significant erosion happening on the north side in the Nehalem Spit is that that particular jetty is very small, and so sand is able to basically go around the end of it and is not being trapped. So the patterns we're seeing here in terms of reorientation of our shorelines is very consistent, and we actually find this at multiple other beaches along our coastline. So again, I wanted to come back to this sort of conceptual model where change is being largely driven by these changes in wave directions, and particularly the role of El Niños. And El Niños have been especially persistent over the last 3 decades in terms of resulting in much more enhanced erosion towards the north ends of our cells. So this simple model in the upper left there is actually, as I said, is a simple model. And in reality, there are much more complex processes going on. So I want to finish up just with some comments about dredging, because obviously that's an important possible sediment source within this particular system. The other one is rivers, but it turns out that these rivers are largely sediment sinks, which means sediment tends to mainly stay in them as opposed to going out and feeding the beaches. That's the general model, and it's borne out by studies and work that's been done by many researchers at Oregon State and elsewhere. So in terms of dredging, what I wanted to point out is where the main dredge disposal sites are in relation to Yaquina Bay. There are 2 main sites, one in the north, one in the south, that are well offshore in about 120 feet water depth, extending to about 140, 150 feet water depth. You can see 2 reefs, one on the north side, North Reef, north of the jetty, and South Reef on the south side. And obviously, South Beach here, a tremendous surfing area, as many of you probably experience. What I can tell you is that this is data that's been supplied very kindly by Rod Moritz from the Corps of Engineers. What he was able to share with me is that in terms of dredging activities that takes place within the channel here, those sediments are placed originally were placed mostly in the north side, and over the period of about 15 years, about 2.6 million cubic yards of sand was placed there. It turns out that that site has lost about 300,000 cubic yards of sand. On the south side, this area has actually only just been started to be used since about 2012. And over the sort of 4-year period from 2012 to 2016, about 1.3 million cubic yards of sand has been placed there. But this particular this south side area is actually much more erosive. And it's actually lost about 960,000 cubic yards of sand. Well, so is that sand, can that sand actually move onto the beaches and move north and supply, let's say, Aga Beach? Well, the short answer is, if you look at the wave dynamics and you do some math, you find that actually that sediment is not really able to be dispersed and driven onshore as very effectively. And the reason for that is that when you start to look at the role of waves in driving sediment transport and where it entrains and moves sand, what you find is that areas in blue is effectively what we call our littoral zone. So that's about where under average conditions, that is the area in which sand is being moved about in both on-offshore directions, so out to form the bars and then back onto the beaches. That's where the bulk of the wave-driven sand movement is taking place, and that extends to depths of about 50 to 60 feet. But the disposal sites are actually in depths of water that are about 120 to 150 feet. And while waves can actually entrain, move that sand and get it mobilized, those waves, in terms of the motions of the orbital particles in the waves that make up the waves, those motions are actually able to cancel themselves out. They move slightly forward, i.e. towards the land, and slightly back. And the net movement is effectively zero as a result of wave processes. But in contrast, currents, as in deeper ocean currents, are able to then move that sediment that waves would otherwise not be able to move. And that those currents have a tendency to drive that sand offshore and to the north. So the consensus from the Corps of Engineers is that waves are certainly unlikely to be driving sand from those deep water disposal sites off Yucuna Bay and driving them onto the beaches. So coming back to the model that I presented earlier, which is what we see happening in the Newport Agate Beach area, is probably more a function of changes that are taking place along the southern portions of our littoral cell, extending all the way down to Yachats. And I'll stop there and happy to take questions.
All right, thank you, John. I know Jay had to step out for a bit, so we'll see if Jay's back. So I guess I'll split the questions a little bit between both of you guys. So first off, we had a question from Kay. Kay was a bit prophetic because they were asking about dredge dumping right before you went into that section of your talk. So I think we have that part handled, but they also wanted to know, do you know which year they lengthened the jetty down there?
Oh, goodness me. I know they did some remediation work a number of years ago. I'm thinking 5 to 10 years ago, as far as I recall. Maybe Jay, you might know.
Which jetty was this?
I think they did some remediation work on the North Jetty, but I just can't remember the specifics.
Is that Tillamook Jetty we're talking at?
No, I'm sorry, Yucuna Bay. Yucuna Bay.
Yeah, well, I know that they extended the North Jetty. I believe it goes back to the 70s, and I'm not aware of any big rehab projects to either of the Yucuna jetties in the last 25 years. I don't believe.
We just had Charlie Plybon, who you guys probably know, chipped in. He must have jumped on the Google, says 1958 was the original build date. Okay, cool. I know we've been talking about Agate Beach a lot, but is Beverly Beach also, are they losing sand over time? That's coming from Lee.
Yeah, so Beverly Beach is kind of a different beast in that, and I mentioned this right at the very beginning, it's actually what we call a sand-starved littoral cell. It has an even more finite sand resource there, which is very, very limited. There are no significant sources of sediment or sand that would actually supply the beach, other than a small section down by the Moolac Shores area, where there's a series of old Pleistocene dune bluffs there that are actually being eroded, and that's providing a little bit of sand to that system. But it really is very limited relative to the changes, the bigger sort of picture changes that are taking place with gradual rise in sea levels, as well as the role of ocean waves, which have been progressively been increasing up through certainly around early 2000 period, that would actually counter a lot of that limited sand source. So it's sediment starved, and if anything, it's probably losing sand.
Okay, cool. From early when we were talking about riprap and people collecting from the beach, we had a couple questions about that, Jay. Someone was asking, is OSP seeing an interest in cobble-based revetment?
So the answer is cobble-based revetments, according to the literature that I've read, is not the most effective for protecting the shoreline in Oregon because of the high energy wave environment we have here in the Pacific Northwest. It's considered a dynamic revetment because it's not fixed in place, and dynamic revetments tend to move up and down the shoreline and eventually get scattered and dissipate over time. They need to be replenished. So basically the literature that I've seen doesn't encourage it for long-term protection. And unfortunately, most of the requests that we see are geared towards shoreline hardening with structural type of shoreline protection. There are a couple of places where properties are not eligible for shoreline protection structures. And there's one situation between Yachats and Walport where I worked with a property owner and allowed them to place 49 cubic yards of cobble to protect what's left of their property in front of their home. And that seems to have held up fairly well over the last few years since it was installed, although I think it's due for a little bit of replenishment.
Okay.
So can I speak to that as well? So they're actually, so I take a slightly different view from Jay on this one. There are actually two examples of dynamic revetments that have been constructed on the Oregon coast. One at Cape Lookout State Park, whereas they were able to utilize natural cobbles in that area, but they had been losing material, and so Parks actually added some additional cobble to that particular site. And it's actually performed remarkably well. I mean, it was actually built in 1999 and has withstood some of the largest storm wave conditions imaginable on this coastline, and come out of it, you know, relatively unscathed for the cost of actually what it took to build that structure, which was largely utilizing existing material. There is another revetment, dynamic revetment up by the South Columbia River Jetty, and it was built by the Corps of Engineers a few years ago. I think it was 2013, and it has been performing extremely well. The downside about cobble revetments is that when this, and Jay was right, when these types of structures are exposed to waves, they're designed to move about. They're designed to actually change their shape in order to mitigate the effects of the wave run up on those gravels, on those cobbles. And they change their shape by lowering themselves and then steepening themselves up as cobbles are driven back up under certain conditions. One of the great things about them is that because it requires a lot more force to actually move them, the cobbles have a propensity to stay at the back of the beach. And I showed examples earlier of Agate Beach, where you could see the cobbles piled up at the toe of those bluffs there. And that's very typical of what we see at many, many sites up and down the Oregon coast. The downside is that in really, really big storms, that stuff can be actually distributed, you know, well out onto the beach. And so, you know, as you can see in the photo here, you can see cobbles. Actually, this was taken just south of the South Columbia River Jetty. You can see cobbles extending out into the beach there, and that can be a bit of a bummer when you're, you know, walking on those.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks, guys. Charlie just chipped in. If any of you guys want to know in the audience more about cobbles, he actually did his master's thesis on the cobble revetment up at Cape Lookout. Hand in hand with that, don't want to just talk about cobbles all night, but someone asked specifically about basalt. What type of cobbles are we usually using? Is it basalt, or are we using a different type of rock?
Generally speaking, it's a high quality basalt. In the most ideal circumstances, you would be trying to find river cobble, which is already rounded. That's probably the best, because then it's closer to what we see on our natural cobble beaches. I mean, the idea here is to emulate essentially emulate nature. In the majority of circumstances, though, it's very difficult to find rounded cobble, and there are challenges, obviously, with trying to take that out of rivers because of impacts to salmon and other, you know, fisheries and biology and things like that. So that's why you don't see a lot of the rounded cobble being sourced for these types of structures, but it's all basalt.
Okay, cool. Jay, this one's probably for you. If we're talking about vehicle beach access, Bob asks, I hear the state is considering closing Pacific City Beach to vehicles except for dory launching. Is that true?
This is true, yes. And so where that's at right now is that it's gone to a rulemaking committee. And the rulemaking committee is comprised of several stakeholders, state and local officials, beach users, dorymen are included, and people from the local area who just have an interest in what happens on the beach. And so it's gone to rulemaking. The committee is preparing to make recommendations to the State Parks Commission that meets quarterly. And then the Parks Commission is gonna consider the rule changes after public hearings to be held at a date to be determined. So part of what was driving that was public safety and the congestion on the beach that has grown tremendously over the last 10 or 15 years, and some of the problems that came out of it. The Tillamook County Commissioners initiated that request after meetings with top managers at the coast, and I couldn't tell you exactly where it's at, except that it's in committee right now, trying to form some language to propose to the commission.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Also with the vehicle access, Rain is wondering have we considered creating a different policy for e-bikes? We have some issues with people with disabilities getting better access to the outdoors, and they're a
Yes.
bit different than like a Jeep or a four-wheeler or other
Yeah.
vehicles down there. Has the state looked into that?
Yeah, so actually the Parks Commission, it was about a year and a half or 2 years ago, had a long discussion about e-bikes, and there was some involvement with the Attorney General's office. And the conclusion was that e-bikes are still considered motor vehicles for the purpose of the regulations on the ocean shore. However, for people with disabilities, we have a program to provide drive-on beach permits in certain circumstances to accommodate people with disabilities, and that accommodation has included e-bikes for certain people in certain locations, and they are preferred actually over motor vehicles. So there's a special permit required to operate a motor vehicle on the beach for people with disabilities. However, we put sideboards on how far they can go on the beach and how fast they can go. And our regulations or sideboards that we put on those are intended to still protect resources and public recreation by limiting how far, how fast, and where, because we have a lot of considerations, including wildlife habitat. As you may know, we manage snowy plovers in several locations on the coast, and snowy plovers don't like any type of disturbance, whether pedestrians or motor vehicles or dogs. And so there's a sort of an overlay of additional protection. So there's a lot of considerations when we provide accommodation for people with disabilities. But yes, if you have a disability that affects your mobility and ability to enjoy the ocean shore, feel free to contact me directly, and I'll line you out with whatever steps you need to take and an application form to get you going.
All right, cool. We have about 7 minutes left, so we'll try to get a few more questions. S-Hog is asking, now we won't get you with the exact date here. How long ago was the north end of Agate Beach rip-wrapped, and do you think that that is contributing to vegetation growth on the north end?
So could the question be more specific about what location at Agate Beach? Because most of Agate Beach is not rip-wrapped from the cove down south. I mean, that's all pretty much natural shoreline for quite a distance. So I'm not really sure what area is being referred to. There is some riprap in areas at North Agate.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of riprap, and that was actually taken from this aerial photo that was actually part of an application by, I presume, these homeowners, and you can see the structure that was built here. That's the only one that I'm aware of, other than a small bit of riprap that was actually built on the south side of Big Creek, which implies that obviously at some point in time, Big Creek or waves were certainly impacting the toe of that bluff on the south side of the creek.
Okay, thank you. Jonathan, your data, do you happen to have anything that goes back pre-1939, or is that sort of the starting point?
No, unfortunately, we would love to have more data, but as I said, the earliest actual measurements of a shoreline was done in the 1920s. The earliest aerial photos we have available to us is 1939. And so, you know, unlike if you were to go to the East Coast and look at shorelines from historical shorelines there, you would have many, many more shorelines available to you going back to even the late 1800s. Unfortunately, we don't have quite the same data here.
Okay, thank you. Jeff asks, Seal Rock, their tide pools there seem to be filling with sand. Do you guys happen to know what's causing that? I know our talk here is mostly Agate Beach, but do you have any insight on the tide pools down there?
I would speculate it's again probably related to the alongshore movement of sand that's actually going around in this particular area here. It's basically bypassing these two sections. So, you know, the LC Spit, there's a series of basalt outcrops there that provide some barrier, but they're not foolproof by any means. And so sand does leak around into those areas. And that's, you know, we see that as part of the sort of natural changes at many of our tide pools up and down the coast.
Okay, cool. Let's see, we only have time for a few more questions here. Quite a few started piling in at the end here. Do you guys theorize, is there a way that we could reduce sand accumulation at Agate Beach? Or do we just, I'm assuming we just let the natural processes take place. This one's coming from Austin Williams.
So I can speak to one element of that. So there is so a lot of the science that's been done so far is really concentrated on changes that have taken place pretty much over the last 40 years. And the conditions that we've been experiencing over the last 40 years have been much more conducive to northward transport in these littoral cells. So it is conceivable that, you know, with the change in our local climate as a function of larger climate cycles, whether it's Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which is probably the main factor that would actually cause any abrupt transformation, it's conceivable we could actually start to see a reversal. But, you know, all bets are off. We can't project that.
Okay, thank you.
So the only other alternative is basically truck and barge, and I don't think that would fly in this particular area.
Okay, excellent. So to anyone whose answer or question we didn't get to, I apologize, but we're trying to keep this to an hour and a half. We will take one last question. Someone was asking about the differences between the sand we see on this coast and the sand we'd see on the East Coast. Is there anything that you guys think is particularly special about the sand in this particular area of Oregon?
Well, I think it depends on where you are on the East Coast. A lot of the sand that you see down there a product of a very different geology, where it's combinations of limestone. So you have a lot of sort of calcite deposits and things like that, forming a different type of sand. You'll notice that, you know, along the Florida coastline, the sands are pristine, sort of white, and that contrasts with our coastline, where much of our coastline is a product of volcanic activity, and so you see our beaches being dominated by quartz and feldspars, a product of breaking down of those basalt sediments over time. You see, particularly this time of year, when you go down on the beach, you'll see obviously our sand tends to be very dark at the back of the beach, almost black. You'll see layers of pink, which is garnets. The black are magnetites, again, all directly sourced from the basalt. It turns out actually a lot of those heavy minerals, the garnets and magnetites, are actually sourced from the Klamath Mountains down in Northern California and accumulated on our beaches as sea level was rising, you know, at around 7,000 years ago.
All right, thank you. And for everyone who tuned in, thank you for joining us again. I'm sorry if we did not get to your question, but if you have any questions, feel free to send us an email and hopefully we can get you an answer. Mike, do you have some closing comments?
Yeah, I just want to really thank Jay and Jonathan. They're both extremely busy, and I appreciate you giving up your time this evening to educate a whole bunch of people on what's going on our beaches. Thanks again. And thanks to everybody who tuned in. If you want to get a hold of Newport Surfrider, we have a Facebook page, Newport Surfrider. We have a website, newport.surfrider.com. And maybe we'll do this again down the line. I'm sure there's a lot more to say about this.
Mike, can you post my email address on the Newport chapter Facebook page so people can follow up with me later?
Yes, I will do that. Okay, thank you very much. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jay and Jonathan, and I'll shut us down. Have a good evening, everyone.
Good night,
Good
guys.
night.